Welcome back to the Real News Network. We're talking to Anand Gopal, who covers Afghanistan for the Christian Science Monitor. Thanks for joining us again.
Thank you.
So let's talk a little bit more about what are potential. Well, first of all, let's talk about Pakistan. The surge of the Pakistani army against the Pakistani Taliban, how is that, if it is, affecting the situation in Afghanistan?
There are lesser numbers of Pakistani Taliban coming over the border, but there haven't been a large number in the first place. So it's not making a huge difference. And you have to remember, the Pakistani state is aligned with the Afghan Taliban and at war with the Pakistani Taliban. So the Afghan Taliban is the main...
Explain that a little more, because most people don't understand that.
Well, so the Pakistani Taliban and Afghan Taliban are distinct insurgencies. The Afghan Taliban's leadership is based in Pakistan, supported by the Pakistani security apparatus.
To the ISI.
Like the ISI. And it's seen by the ISI as representing Pakistani's security interests in Afghanistan.
Which has always wanted Afghanistan as a kind of pro-Pakistan buffer.
Right, pro-Pakistan buffer and a place to fall back on in case there's a war with India, these sorts of things. Now, that's very different from the Pakistani Taliban. The Pakistani Taliban is a completely different organization. They're at war with the Pakistani military. So that's what we're seeing right now, for example, in Swat, where the fighting's been very heavy.
So when there's discussions of some kind of negotiation with the Taliban in terms of Afghanistan, they're talking about the Afghan Taliban. Now, Mullah Omar, where is he in terms of relationship to the Pakistan Taliban and the Afghan Taliban? I know he's clearly with the Afghan Taliban, but does he also have association with the Pakistan Taliban, or is this really quite separate movements?
They're quite separate movements. Mullah Omar is nominally at the head of the Afghan Taliban. They would like the Pakistani Taliban, Afghan Taliban would like the Pakistani Taliban to stop fighting Pakistan. And Mullah Omar has made a few announcements like this. He sent some letters to his Taliban brethren saying, you know, turn your guns away from Pakistan. The real enemy is in Afghanistan. It's the American occupiers. You should fight there. So there's a tension there between the two movements. Whereas the Pakistani Taliban, really their main fight so far has been against their own government in Pakistan.
Now, when I was in Kandahar, I was told by many people how close Mullah Omar was to bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. What is that relationship now in terms of Al-Qaeda and the Pakistani Taliban and Al-Qaeda and the Afghan Taliban?
Al-Qaeda is much closer to the Pakistani Taliban than they are to the Afghan Taliban. Well, one reason is ideological, because the Afghan Taliban is not a global jihadist movement. It has very local aspirations. It wants to reclaim power in Afghanistan. It never talks about attacking the West or attacking London or New York. That's not part of their ideology. The Pakistani Taliban has elements of it which are more of a global jihadist outlook, and Al-Qaeda naturally fits in more with that. And of course, Al-Qaeda right now doesn't exist in Afghanistan at all. There's no presence of Al-Qaeda there. Al-Qaeda exists in the tribal areas of Pakistan, which are controlled by the Pakistani Taliban.
And why is there no presence of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan?
Well, one, in the American invasion, they were able to push them out across the border. And then the reason they weren't able to come back is they really don't have any support of the locals.
So the Afghan Taliban themselves are disassociated themselves with Al-Qaeda?
More or less. There are still some connections. There's still some money that comes in through Al-Qaeda to the Afghan Taliban, but they're distinct movements with distinct goals.
So is there a settlement to be had with the Afghan Taliban and the northern warlord Karzai conglomeration?
There certainly is. The Afghan Taliban have said that they're ready to come to the table. I mean, their sort of essential element there is that they want the troops to leave. But if, as what President Obama says, is that the main security interest here, strategic interest in Afghanistan is to make sure Al-Qaeda doesn't attack the U.S., it's very conceivable that you can work out a deal with the Taliban, Afghan Taliban, and say, listen, we'll leave, the troops will leave, and you guys can come back and work out an arrangement with the Afghan government, as long as you ensure that you don't allow Al-Qaeda back into the country.
Well, then if the Afghan Taliban are more or less distanced from Al-Qaeda, then what is the rationale for the surge in Afghanistan? Given that Obama has said the rationale is to stop Al-Qaeda being in Afghanistan.
This is a question that Afghans ask too. There's not a clear answer to this. I mean, a lot of this I think is inertia. The Americans are here in Afghanistan and they're trying to find an exit. Right now they're short of ideas and they think maybe we can just throw more troops at the situation, get it to a point where the level of violence goes down, you know, and then we can call it a victory and leave. Doesn't shape out. I'm not sure if it's shaping up that way though.
Many people here in the United States are calling for just get out of Afghanistan. What would be the consequences of that?
Well, it depends how we get out. If the Americans just leave tomorrow the way they left in Vietnam, just, you know, basically kicked out. Within 2 days, the Taliban would take over. There'd probably be a civil war after that between the northern groups who hate the Taliban and don't want them in power, and the southern groups that can live with the Taliban. Now, that's if they just leave without a settlement too. But if the Americans leave with a sort of negotiated settlement, it'll have to be a tripartite agreement between the Americans, the Afghan government, and the insurgents. And it would have to involve regional players like Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. And if you can get a sort of settlement agreement, you'd have to rewrite the constitution and basically recreate the state, which was done in 2001. Then it's possible to leave and have some semblance of normalcy and allow the Afghans to start figuring out how they can fix their country themselves.
One of the things that gets, again, almost no discussion in American media is the role of Saudi Arabia in the whole situation, both in Pakistan and in Afghanistan. Have you been able to get a sense of what game they play?
Saudi Arabia has a close relationship with the Taliban, the Afghan Taliban. They're one of the few countries that recognized the regime when they were in power in the 90s, and they've maintained those ties since then. So, for example, in the last year, the Afghan government started making overtures towards the Taliban, saying we want to negotiate. And the way they did that is they called in the Saudis. And they had meetings in Mecca, and they tried to have the Saudis as intermediaries, and because these are acceptable intermediaries to both sides. The Afghan Taliban respect Saudis, and so does the Afghan government. So they have a positive role to play in this.
Well, positive role, but is it also a lever for them? There's this case that, again, got very little coverage in the United States, but when Tony Blair was in the investigation of the bribery scandal over the arms sale to Saudi Arabia, Saudis said to Blair, if you pursue this investigation, we can't guarantee London won't be hit again. There's this sort of shadow in the wings with Saudi Arabia that both Al-Qaeda and Taliban forces are kind of there as a piece on their chessboard. Do you get a sense of that?
Certainly, yeah. And this is one of the reasons I think they've been able to, one of the reasons why they've kept this relationship up with the Taliban and with Al-Qaeda. I mean, most of Al-Qaeda's money still comes from wealthy donors in the Gulf states. Most of the Taliban's money comes from there too. And these are nominally independent of the government, but certainly there's relationships there between the Saudi government and these wealthy individuals. And Saudi Arabia is very interested in its sort of Cold War with Iran, which is taking place, and they would like to see, for example, the Taliban back in power in Afghanistan as sort of leverage against Iran and Shia expansionism in the area.
The other, elephant in the room, to use a hackneyed phrase, is the drug operation. So much of everything that's being fueled on almost all sides of what's happening in Afghanistan have to do with enormous drug trade. What, in terms of a solution, is emerging, if any, on this?
Well, I don't know if a solution's emerging yet, but some people are talking about really focusing on alternative livelihoods. So the people who are growing the poppies, they're growing. You're able to grow poppies in situations in which there's insecurity because you can get away with it. That's why they're doing it. So it's very difficult to just get away with it in one fell swoop. But they're saying, well, let's try to approach this problem by giving them other crops to grow, maize or wheat, and subsidizing it. Because right now, if you grow wheat, you're not going to get as high a price as if you grow poppies, right? So you have to give them the seeds and then subsidize the production.
One proposal was just buy the poppies, and
yeah.
There was apparently one British experiment that sort of started and then stopped, and I've never heard a very good assessment of what was made of it. Why not just buy the poppy crop? Most poppy farmers are not getting paid very much for it.
Yeah, it's another possibility, and you can turn this into morphine and other drugs that are useful instead of getting it into opium. So.
But is there just too many players that are making too much money out of the drug trade to have a real conversation about any of this?
Well, there are a lot of players, but there are certain players that are more important than others. Some of them sit in the Afghan government, and some of them are related to the president of the country. So if you wanted to have a coherent drug policy to do this sort of thing, it's possible. You can approach the right people. You can approach the Minister of Counter-Narcotics, for example, who is not just the Minister of Counter-Narcotics. He also has, people say, has ties to narcotics. And also the president's brother.
Wali Karzai.
Wali Karzai, yes. So there's players that you can approach that'll take probably 80% of this.
For there to be a real solution in Afghanistan, Pakistan has to want a solution. And do they really want a solution short of a Taliban government in Kabul?
I think Pakistan feels that there is no solution short of a Taliban government in Kabul, and the reason is because everything boils down to their rivalry with India. India has deep ties with the Northern Alliance of these warlords in the north and the other ethnic groups outside of the Pashtuns. So India, Russia, and Iran sort of have deep connections there, and so that leaves Pakistan with ties to the Pashtuns. And of course, there's more Pashtuns living in Pakistan than there are in Afghanistan. So the plight of the Pashtuns is in the interest of the Pakistanis. They don't want any sort of independent Pashtun state. That's a big concern for them. So they want a Pashtun group in power that doesn't want an independent Pashtun state. And at the same time, they want it to be Pashtun, so it doesn't ally with the Indians, for example. And really the only group that fits this description is the Taliban at the moment.
Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.